Hey everyone, it's Sevy. Since I'm done with my review of Sara's kit at C0, I'm now ready to activate and review her constellations all the way to C6. In this video, I'm going to go through her constellations one by one, show you the gameplay changes that each one brings, and give my thoughts on which constellations are the best, which are good, and which are meh. So let's dive right in. The first constellation says that when her skill damages opponents or grants characters the attack buff, the skill cooldown is reduced by 1 second. Honestly, for me, her skill cooldown wasn't that big of a problem. During my experience at C0, I find that when I had to refresh her skill, it was almost always ready anyway, and if not, I only had to wait a second or less. For example, in this casual gameplay with Baal, I gave her the attack buff, did some normal attacks, and then switched back to Sara to refresh the buff. I used up the entire 6 seconds of the buff duration with Baal and just had to wait less than a second to do Sara's skill in charged shot again. So activating means that if you wait to maximize the entire 6 seconds, your Sara's skill will now be ready in 99.9% of scenarios. In this clip, pay attention to the skill cooldown icon. When the enemy got damaged, it gets a 1 second reduction. So this seems more like a quality of life thing. It doesn't really fix a problem since I feel her skill cooldown wasn't a problem to begin with, but it guarantees smoother gameplay. C1 is meh for me. For her C2, it says that you generate a crow feather when you activate her skill. When you blink back, there is a feather in your original position already, rather than having to do a charged shot. And what's great is that you still have your charged shot crow feather waiting to be triggered. And remember that even if you switch Sara out, this doesn't go away, and you can still trigger the charged shot crow feather. So what's great about this constellation is it saves you the effort of having to do a charged shot to get the attack buff. This is especially useful in time-sensitive or hectic scenarios where you just need to get the buff ASAP. It also effectively gives you 2 crow feather or 2 consecutive instances of attack buff in one skill cycle. Another benefit of this constellation is that Sara is now a little bit more viable in quick swap teams. I mentioned in my previous video that it would be harder to do burst quick swap teams with Sara since she had to interrupt your rotation, and you have to wait for the cooldown to refresh the buff every time you want to use your team's burst. Now that's less of a hassle. Let me demonstrate this with Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Kazuha. I generate the buff with only her skill press, then I switch and use Xiangling's burst. Generate the buff again with her charged shot and then use Kazuha's burst. And generate the buff again but with her burst, then use Xingqiu's burst. So why would you want to do this instead of just using Bennett for this team? I don't know, but at least the option is more available to you now. And with other teams that aren't quick swap focused, this constellation will make Sara's gameplay much more convenient and even opens up new tactical decisions. C2 is a great buff for me. C3 just gives her burst 3 additional levels. Personally, I think that C3 should have upgraded her skill instead, like with some other 4 stars. Sara's skill is more important since this is where her attack buff bonus ratio depends on. Even though I use Sara as a burst DPS, she's still mainly my attack buffer, and having a stronger buff adds more to her support utility. C3 is for me, only because I wish they'd switched it with C5. C4 is very straightforward. It just makes her burst unleash 6 clusters of AoE damage rather than 4. Let me quickly show you the difference here in these clips. You get more AoE coverage from her burst, which ensures that if you're fighting mobs of enemies, you're less likely to miss with those lightning clusters. If you're in co-op, you're also less likely to miss giving your teammates that attack buff, since they can also get buffed from her lightning clusters. If you're fighting a large enemy though, they could get damaged by 2 clusters simultaneously. Again, another quality of life upgrade, but not really that game-changing. C4 is just okay for me. C5 upgrades her skill talent levels, and like I said before, this should have been switched with C3. The benefit of this constellation is very obvious, and it increases Sara's support utility by a lot, and it boosts your entire team damage output. C5 is a great constellation in my opinion. Finally, her C6. It increases the crit damage of your buff teammates' Electro damage by a whopping 60%. This is her best constellation and so far, the best quote-unquote Electro buff we have in the form of a character. It's equivalent to a crit damage circlet or 5-star weapon with a crit damage substat. For one, she has a lower attack buff ratio compared to Bennett's, but this constellation equalizes the playing field or maybe even surpassing that because of the insanely huge crit damage bonus, but only for Electro. So take for example this comparison of Kaching with Sara before and after her C6 buff. Pausing at certain points, we can see the difference in Kaching's charged attack damage, skill damage, and burst damage. By my estimate, it gave around 10 to 20% more damage output versus the Primo Geo Bishop. This will vary depending on your opponent's defense, resistance, if there are other buffs in play, etc. Of course, there are important conditions. You need to be aware of triggering Sara's attack buff with your Electro characters, which requires more micromanaging. This is only a small window of 6 seconds, so you have to spend that time wisely to maximize the crit damage buff. This also does not snapshot, so as soon as the buff duration starts and ends, that's it. So it won't synergize well with longer abilities like Beto's Burst or Official's Oz. And your Electro character needs to have a high enough crit rate so that this buff won't go to waste because it's dependent first on actually getting critical hits. Still, when it works very well. Also, contrast to Sara's C6 with Bennett's C6, which people avoid like the plague. Bennett's final constellation has a potentially huge disadvantage, but Sara's is so value-adding and you don't get anything detrimental. C6 is a great constellation and a must-have for Electro teams. That's all her constellations activated and tested out. So to recap, I think her best constellations are C2 and C6. If you're a free-to-play or low spender, you can aim for C2 only, and I think that you can be happy with that. I would have recommended at least C3 if C3 increased her skill talents, but nope. So C2 it is. If you can't afford to wail on the banner to snipe her though, then you can stop at C5, but why do that when her C6 is one copy away, right? Her C1, C3, and C4 are just meh for me. Her true potential is really locked at C5 and C6, so for those who can't afford to get them right now, you will have to wait for future reruns. Is it worth getting constellations of her? If your goal is to use her long term, then setting the goal for a high constellation Sara I think is very worth it. We also know that Electro is kind of an underwhelming element in the current meta. Are there going to be any significant Electro buffs and changes that will elevate its status? That remains to be seen. But when there is, it's likely that C6 Sara will be a must-have for Electro teams. So fingers crossed that her constellation investment pays off. Yae Miko is also not too far from dropping, so for those who plan to pull and main her, then C6 Sara will be very useful, like with Raiden Shogun now. So that's it guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to see my review and build recommendations for Kujou Sara, I'll link them in the description. Comment below what constellation your Sara is and what you think of them. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you soon. Take care!